Hey, welcome back. Get comfortable, settle in, pull those blankets up, and just let the world outside go quiet for a little while. Tonight we're doing something a little different. No dramatic cliffhangers, no sudden jumps, just you, a soft voice, and 200 of the wildest, most fascinating, strangest, most surprisingly tender facts about one of the most layered animated shows ever made, Rick and Morty. You already know the show, but I promise, by the time we drift toward the end of this one, there are going to be things you've never heard before. Little pieces of trivia tucked so deep inside the production history, the lore, the science, and the bizarre real-world chaos this show created, that even the most dedicated fans tend to miss them entirely. So close your eyes if you want, or just let your gaze go soft and unfocused. We're going to take this slowly, one fact at a time, wandering through the strange and fascinating world that Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland built. And we're going to make it feel like a story, because it really is one. It's a story about two guys who met at a film festival, who made something ridiculous and crude, and somehow accidentally created one of the most philosophically complex pieces of popular entertainment in modern television history. That's the kind of story worth telling quietly, in the dark, while the world winds down around you. Let's begin. Before there was Rick Sanchez, before there was a portal gun, before there was a garage converted into a secret laboratory, there was a short film festival in Los Angeles called Channel 101, and that is where everything begins. Channel 101 was a non-profit monthly short film festival co-founded by Dan Harmon. The way it worked was elegantly simple. Filmmakers would submit short pilots, no longer than 5 minutes, and a live audience would vote on which ones got to continue as an ongoing series. It was an incubator for weird, experimental ideas, the kind of place where creative people who had nothing to lose could take swings they'd never get to take inside a traditional studio. Dan Harmon ran it. And it was there that he first encountered Justin Roiland. Justin Roiland started submitting content to Channel 101 in 2004, about a year after the festival launched. His work was described by those who attended as sick and twisted, full of shock value humor that tended to confuse the live audience rather than win them over. Most people didn't quite know what to make of him, but Dan Harmon did. Harmon was drawn to Roiland's sensibility, to the chaotic energy of his ideas, and the two started collaborating. The very first seed of what would become Rick and Morty was not a heartwarming origin story. It was essentially an act of creative defiance. In 2006, Roiland was getting cease and desist letters from Bill Cosby's lawyers because of a short film series he'd made called House of Cosbys. Frustrated and feeling creatively boxed in, Roiland decided to make something even more legally dangerous on purpose. He created a short animated parody of Back to the Future, and he deliberately intended to name it in a way that would force Universal Studios lawyers to come after him. The short film was called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty. It starred parodies of Doc Brown and Marty McFly, though Roiland later renamed them Doc Smith and Marty McDonald's to sidestep lawsuits. The content of the short was extremely explicit and inappropriate for general audiences, to put it as politely as possible. Roiland himself later described it as the result of having nothing to lose and wanting to see how far he could push things. It was deliberately designed to provoke. Here's the part that makes this origin story genuinely remarkable. As Roiland was editing the audio for the Doc and Marty short, something clicked for him. He realized that the voices he was doing for the two characters felt alive in a way he hadn't planned. The voice he used for Doc was very close to what would eventually become Rick's voice, complete with the halting, hesitating speech patterns, and even the burping. And the voice for Marty was virtually identical to what would later become Morty. He'd stumbled into something without meaning to. Dan Harmon later called the Doc and Marty short a bastardization, a pornographic vandalization of what Rick and Morty would ultimately represent. But he also saw the potential in the characters and the dynamic between them. The push and pull between the brilliant older figure and the young, nervous companion was compelling even in its crudest form. It had something. They both knew it. The show might never have been made at all if Dan Harmon hadn't been fired. In 2012, Harmon was removed from his position as showrunner on Community, the beloved NBC sitcom he'd created. During that uncertain period between projects, Adult Swim approached him about developing something new. They were looking for a show with broader appeal, something that could pull in younger viewers. Harmon, who'd never worked in animation before and wasn't sure it was the right fit for him, made a phone call to Roiland and asked if he had any animated ideas sitting around. Roiland immediately brought up Doc and Mahardy. Adult Swim greenlit the Rick and Morty pilot almost immediately. The network had been searching for something that felt genuinely different from what they already had, and the pitch for Rick and Morty was different. It was a science fiction comedy with real emotional depth hiding underneath the chaos, a family drama wrapped inside an interdimensional adventure show. The combination was unusual enough that the network moved quickly. The very first episode of Rick and Morty aired on the 2nd of December 2013. It was written by Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland and directed by Roiland himself. The show premiered to around 1.5 million viewers that night, which was a solid number for Adult Swim at the time. Nobody in that moment could have predicted what was coming. The character names Rick and Morty were chosen to echo the Back to the Future origins without being too on the nose. Rick is a loose nod to Doc Brown, and Morty echoes Marty McFly, but the rhyming quality of the pairing gives the names their own distinct energy. The original name for the grandfather character in early development was Rick Sanchez, which stuck all the way through because Roiland felt strongly that a Hispanic surname gave the character an unexpected dimension, a detail that would quietly matter more and more as the show developed Rick's backstory across later seasons. Dan Harmon initially had significant reservations about working in animation. His entire career up to that point had been built around dialogue-heavy, character-driven writing for live action. He was deeply uncertain whether his process, which relied heavily on rewriting and refining through the rehearsal stage, would translate to animation, where so much gets locked in during production. He took the leap anyway, and the adjustment process would shape how the show was written in ways that made it distinct from almost anything else on television. The show almost had a very different name. In very early development conversations, multiple titles were floated. The Rick and Morty pairing felt right almost immediately, but there were discussions about whether the show should have a more traditional science fiction title, something that would indicate the genre more clearly to casual viewers. The creators pushed back. The simple, almost absurdly plain title of the two main characters' names, said together, was part of the joke. It was the joke, and it stayed. Roiland and Harmon met in a way that both men have described as one of those strange, low-stakes creative encounters that you never expect to define your career. Harmon took a liking to Roiland's humor at a time when almost nobody else seemed to understand it. That mutual recognition, that sense that someone else gets the joke you're making even when nobody around you does, was the foundation of everything that came after. The show's decision to use the multiverse as its central structural device wasn't originally tied to any deep scientific interest. Early in development, the portal gun was conceived primarily as a storytelling tool, a way to put the characters in any situation the writers wanted without being constrained by a single setting. The fact that the multiverse concept happens to align remarkably well with actual quantum physics theories came a little later, as the writers started researching the science to make the episodes feel grounded. Fact 14.5. The early pilot process for Rick and Morty involved a significant amount of iteration on the visual design of the characters. Rick went through several different design passes before landing on the version we know today, with his white hair, his lab coat, and the distinctive look of exhausted brilliance that the animation team settled on. Morty's design similarly evolved through multiple passes, with early versions making him look slightly younger and more purely innocent before the team found the specific proportion of dopey and earnest that makes him immediately identifiable. Channel 101, the festival that started it all, used a specific format for its events. Live audiences at each screening would vote on which shows continued and which ones were canceled. It was a brutally immediate form of feedback that Roiland credited with sharpening his instincts about what actually landed with a crowd versus what he only thought would land. That experience of real-time creative feedback was something he carried into the writer's room. Before we move into the next section, drop a comment wherever you're watching from. Your city, your country, what time it is there, and if you haven't yet, a subscription costs you nothing and helps more than you know. We appreciate every single one of you. The voice acting behind Rick and Morty is one of the most unusual and frankly extraordinary aspects of the show's production. For the first 6 seasons, both lead characters, Rick and Morty, were voiced by the same person. That is extremely rare in animation. Understanding how those voices came to be, and what happened when they had to be replaced, tells you a great deal about just how embedded a performer can become in a show's identity. Justin Roiland voiced both Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith for the entire run of the show, from its premiere in December 2013 through season 6. That means that in every single scene featuring both characters together, Roiland was essentially having a conversation with himself, switching rapidly between the two distinct vocal personalities. The amount of mental flexibility required to do that across thousands of lines of dialogue per season is genuinely impressive. Rick's voice was partially inspired by the vocal style of a comedian named Foster Brooks, who was known for performing a character who was always slightly drunk. Brooks performed this character on variety shows in the 1960s and 70s, and the specific quality of speech he developed, that slurred but functional, brilliant but clearly impaired cadence, influenced how Roiland approached Rick's dialogue. The burping was Roiland's own addition, and it became one of the show's most recognizable sonic signatures. Roiland famously drank actual beer during recording sessions to achieve more authentic-sounding burps during Rick's lines. This became a well-known piece of trivia among fans, but the process was more disciplined than it sounds. The burps were not improvised randomly. They were worked into specific moments in the dialogue where they would land with comedic or emotional impact, and Roiland timed them with real precision. A significant portion of Roiland's dialogue across all seasons was improvised. The production team would give him a loose sense of what a scene needed to accomplish emotionally or narratively, and Roiland would riff off the script, going off in directions that the writers hadn't planned. Many of the show's most beloved moments and catchphrases emerged from these improvised sessions. The writers would then review the recordings and often build future episodes around things Roiland had improvised, because they were simply funnier than what had been scripted. The rest of the main voice cast brings together a mix of established performers and names who were building their profiles. Sarah Chalka voices Beth Smith, the show's mother figure and horse surgeon. Interestingly, Chalky is the third time she has played a version of a blonde doctor character, having previously appeared as a blonde doctor character in both the long-running medical comedy Scrubs and a recurring role in How I Met Your Mother. The character types follow her. Chris Parnell, best known to many people for his years as a cast member and writer at Saturday Night Live, voices Jerry Smith. Parnell brings a very specific quality to Jerry, a kind of desperately earnest quality that makes the character both pitiful and somehow weirdly lovable despite everything. Parnell has said he approaches Jerry with genuine empathy, playing the character's embarrassments and failures from the inside rather than commenting on them from the outside. Spencer Grammer voices Summer Smith, the teenage eldest daughter. Grammer is the daughter of Kelsey Grammer, who famously spent 2 decades voicing Frasier Crane in Cheers and the long-running spin-off Frasier. It gives Summer a kind of inherited voice acting royalty background that the show has never directly acknowledged, but fans are well aware of. In January 2023, Adult Swim cut ties with Justin Roiland following the public disclosure of domestic violence charges against him in Orange County, California. The charges were later dismissed by the district attorney, citing insufficient evidence, but within the same month the charges went public. Adult Swim had already announced that the characters of Rick and Morty would be recast for Season 7 and beyond. The search for new voices for Rick and Morty was described by showrunner Scott Marder as one of the most challenging casting processes he'd ever been involved in. The production reviewed thousands of candidates. Thousands! The difficulty with Rick's voice specifically was that most approximations landed somewhere wrong. Marder described the tendency of impressions to sound, in his words, like Macho Man Randy Savage or like a cousin of his. Finding someone who could capture the essential quality of the voice without slipping into parody of a parody was enormously difficult. The new voice of Rick Sanchez is Ian Cardone, a Boston-born actor who had previously done voiceover work for the WWE, Sci-Fi Channel promos, and Apple TV. Cardone's credits before landing Rick and Morty were relatively modest, including a small role in a Larry David HBO project and uncredited work in a mainstream comedy film. Landing one of the most prominent voice acting roles in the history of Adult Swim was, by any reasonable measure, the role of a lifetime appearing without much visible warning. The new voice of Morty Smith is Harry Belden, a Chicago native who had appeared in an episode of Chicago Med and an episode of the gentle, low-key comedy series Joe Pera Talks With You. Belden has spoken in interviews about how surreal the experience has been, describing waking up every morning for the first month after landing the role and asking his girlfriend whether it had actually happened. He described it as repeatedly needing to be reminded that, yes, he was actually the new Morty. Adult Swim kept the identities of Cardone and Belden under incredibly tight wraps in the lead-up to the Season 7 premiere. Screeners sent to critics before the season launched did not include credits at the end. The network even reneged on a promise to reveal the actors' names under embargo before the premiere. They kept the secret until the actual episode aired on the 15th of October 2023, when the credits rolled and the names appeared for the first time. It was one of the most effectively guarded casting secrets in recent television history. Season 7 of Rick and Morty holds the notable distinction of being the first season produced entirely without any voice work from Roiland. Despite being co-creator of the show and the voice behind both lead characters for 61 episodes across 6 seasons, Roiland contributed nothing to Season 7. His company, Justin Roiland's solo Vanity Card Productions, was still listed in the credits for legal reasons, but the man himself had no creative involvement. The Season 7 premiere's opening credits quietly dropped the traditional created by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon credit that had appeared at the start of every episode since 2013. It was replaced simply with the show's logo. The removal was noticeable to longtime fans and has not been officially explained by the network. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Season 7 transition is how many viewers reported finding the new voices immediately convincing. The production team had invested enormous effort in finding soundalikes rather than replacing the voices with something clearly different, as the Hulu show Solar Opposites did when they brought in Dan Stevens to replace Roiland. The Rick and Morty team wanted continuity. By almost all accounts, they got it. The show's other recurring voice performers include a number of unexpected names who have appeared across different episodes. Alfred Molina, the acclaimed Spanish-American actor known for roles in Boogie Nights and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, has appeared on the show. Susan Sarandon has lent her voice to the show. Gillian Anderson, Christina Hendricks, Stephen Colbert, and a genuinely remarkable list of other performers have passed through the recording booth for guest appearances. Nolan North, one of the most prolific video game voice actors alive, the man behind the voice of Nathan Drake in the Uncharted series among hundreds of other roles, has appeared in Rick and Morty. The crossover between high-profile voice acting communities and the show is extensive, reflecting how much respect the animation world has for the quality of the writing and the prestige associated with appearing in it. Dan Harmon himself has voiced several minor characters across different episodes, a fact that many casual fans don't realize. The writer's room has a tradition of contributing vocally to smaller roles when needed, which gives certain background characters an unusually authentic quality. There's something faintly surreal about the show's co-creator occasionally muttering in the background of his own creation. The recording sessions for Rick and Morty are done separately for each actor, which is standard for animation. But Roiland's sessions were described as particularly unusual because he would often ad-lib entire pages of dialogue before remembering to say the scripted version. The team would record everything, and editors would then assemble the best elements from both the scripted and improvised takes. This meant the show's post-production team was working with significantly more raw material than a typical animated show. Fact 34.5. The process of replacing Roiland required the new voice actors to study his performances carefully, without falling into pure imitation. The risk with any sound-alike casting is that the performer becomes a copy rather than a continuation, producing something that sounds technically correct but feels hollow because the specific quality that made the original performance alive is hard to locate through mimicry alone. Both Cardoni and Belden have described taking slightly different approaches to this challenge. Cardoni focused on finding the emotional logic underneath Rick's speech patterns, while Belden concentrated on the rhythm of Morty's anxiety and the specific quality of his voice under stress versus at rest. Both approached the characters from the inside rather than from the outside, which is ultimately why the transition worked as well as it did. Jerry Smith's character was named after Roiland's dog. The dog, whose name was Jerry, passed away sometime around the show's later seasons. Roiland had mentioned the naming in interviews, and the detail stuck with fans as one of those unexpectedly human moments within the machinery of a big television production. One of the things that separates Rick and Morty from most animated comedies is the degree to which the writers made a genuine effort to ground their most outlandish concepts in real scientific theory. Not every episode gets the science right. Some episodes deliberately get it spectacularly wrong for comic effect. But the show has a surprisingly deep relationship with actual physics, biology, and philosophy of science that rewards viewers who know where to look. The central premise of the show, that there are infinite parallel universes that differ from one another based on different outcomes of every possible event, is directly drawn from a real scientific framework called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. This interpretation was formally proposed by physicist Hugh Everett III in 1957. Everett's idea was that rather than quantum possibilities collapsing into a single outcome when observed, every possible outcome actually occurs in its own branching reality. Rick and Morty is, in a sense, a story set inside Everett's mathematics. The Season 2 premiere, an episode called A Wrinkle in Time, is built almost entirely around Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, one of the foundational principles of quantum mechanics. The uncertainty principle states that you cannot simultaneously know the precise position and the precise speed of a particle. If you measure one, you disturb the other. The episode visualizes this by having Rick, Morty, and Summer literally split reality into multiple branches by trying to know too precisely where they are in time, and then finding they've made it impossible to collapse back into a single timeline. It's a genuinely creative use of a real concept. The same A Wrinkle in Time episode also draws on a thought experiment called Schrödinger's cat, proposed by physicist Erwin Schrödinger in 1935. The thought experiment describes a cat in a sealed box with a device that may or may not have released a deadly poison, and argues that until you open the box and observe the cat, quantum mechanics technically requires you to consider the cat simultaneously alive and dead. The episode makes this visual when Rick reveals that their house is floating in cat-infested space, a very specific nod to the original thought experiment. Rick's portal gun, the device that allows instant travel between dimensions, is described in the show as operating on what Rick calls portal fluid. While there is obviously no real portal fluid in the scientific literature, the concept of what the gun does maps broadly onto the theoretical idea of wormholes, which are legitimate solutions to Einstein's field equations of general relativity. A wormhole would essentially be a shortcut through spacetime connecting two different points. The portal gun is a wormhole generator that's been made compact enough to carry in a coat pocket. The show's universe designations are not random. Fans have spent a great deal of time cataloging the different dimension labels that appear across different episodes, and the patterns in those labels suggest that the production team put thought into the system. The primary universe of the show, the one our Rick and Morty call home, is designated C137. Cesium-137 is a real radioactive isotope produced by nuclear fission. The choice is not accidental. There are suggestions built into the lore that Rick C137 has a specific and dark relationship with that number, though the show has left certain aspects deliberately ambiguous. Rick's spaceship in the show is powered by dark matter, which is a real scientific concept, though its exact nature remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of physics. Dark matter is thought to make up approximately 27% of the universe's total mass and energy, but it doesn't interact with electromagnetic forces, which means we can't see it directly. We know it exists because of the gravitational effects it has on visible matter. Rick using dark matter as a fuel source is a bit like saying a car runs on the unidentified majority of the universe. It's an audacious scientific flex even in fictional form. The Season 2 episode called Morty Night Run features a character named Fart, who is an amorphous, gaseous alien being made of methane. Fart is voiced by Jermaine Clement, one half of the New Zealand musical comedy duo Flight of the Conchords. The episode explores questions about the ethics of killing a clearly conscious, self-aware being, and uses Fart as a vehicle for examining those questions in a surprisingly sincere way. The episode is one of the show's strongest examples of using science fiction premises to raise genuinely interesting ethical dilemmas, rather than just playing them for laughs. Rick and Morty frequently explores the concept of simulation theory, the idea that our perceived reality might itself be a simulation running inside some larger computational system. The show addressed this most directly in episodes dealing with artificial intelligence and virtual realities. But the undercurrent of the idea that nothing you perceive can be guaranteed to be what it appears runs through the show's epistemology on a much broader level. It connects to the show's nihilistic philosophical streak in a way that feels deliberate. The show's treatment of time travel is deliberately critical. Several episodes reference or directly address the narrative problems with time travel as a storytelling device, and both creators have stated publicly that they have an active distaste for time travel as a plot mechanism. One of the early running gags was a device called time freeze, and the show's writers have confirmed in various interviews that intentional avoidance of time travel plots as a solution to narrative problems is practically a house rule in the writer's room. Rick's time crystal, when it appears, is handled in ways that deliberately highlight the absurdity and danger of messing with temporal causality. In the world of the show, Rick has clearly solved time travel as a concept, as evidenced by small details scattered across different episodes. In the show's visual language, time is written using vector notation rather than scalar notation, which is a genuine mathematical distinction. A vector quantity has both a magnitude and a direction. A scalar quantity has only a magnitude. Writing time as a vector implies that Rick has solved the problem of time's directionality, that he understands time not merely as a flowing river moving in one direction, but as something with measurable, navigable dimensions. It's a detail that most viewers miss entirely. The Pickle Rick episode, which won the show its second Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, is on its surface a ridiculous premise. Rick transforms himself into a pickle to avoid family therapy. But the episode is a careful and surprisingly accurate exploration of avoidant coping mechanisms and what therapists call intellectualization, the use of logic and abstract thinking as a way to avoid confronting difficult emotions. Dr. Wong's speech to Rick at the end of the episode has been praised by mental health professionals as a genuinely insightful portrayal of how high-functioning individuals use their intelligence to avoid doing the real emotional work. The episode Body Horror, in which Morty's grandfather inserts him into the body of another creature for scientific purposes, draws on the very real history of miniaturization fantasies in science fiction, which in turn connect to real research into micro and nanoscale medicine. In 2015, microscopic machines successfully traveled inside a living mouse to deliver nanoparticles. The science of sending incredibly small things into the body for therapeutic purposes is real and ongoing, even if it currently exists at a much more primitive level than anything Rick's garage lab could produce. The show's treatment of cloning is more scientifically thoughtful than most pop culture uses of the concept. When Rick creates a clone of Beth in a later season, the show explicitly grapples with what it means for identity and consciousness. This connects to a real philosophical debate in cognitive science and personal identity theory called the teleportation problem, or the ship of Theseus problem, as applied to consciousness. If you copy someone perfectly, atom by atom, and the copy believes they are the original, which one has the moral status of personhood? The show doesn't answer this question. It lets it sit and feel uncomfortable, which is the appropriate response. Dimension jumping in the show follows internally consistent rules that the writers developed early in production and have largely stuck to. Portals are shown in green, which has been maintained as a consistent visual shorthand across all seasons and into the new casting era. The color choice connects to the show's general visual grammar of using green as Rick's signature color, from his portal gun fluid to the glow of various experiments, to certain visual details in the opening credits. Fact 49.5. The show's animation team developed a specific set of visual rules for how portals behave when they open and close. A portal opening always shows the swirling vortex expanding outward from a central point. A portal closing always collapses inward toward the same central point. This inward collapse, the sense of the portal retracting into nothing, was chosen deliberately by the animation department because it communicates a finality. When the portal closes, the door is fully shut. There is no lingering trace. Rick moves on completely. Real physicists have written papers and blog posts engaging with Rick and Morty's scientific premises. Physicist Jim Kakalios, who wrote a popular book called The Physics of Superheroes, has spoken positively about the show's engagement with science. There's a subculture within physics communication that uses the show as a teaching tool for concepts like quantum mechanics, thermodynamics, and the philosophy of science. The show isn't scientifically accurate in a rigorous technical sense, but it's scientifically curious in a way that creates genuine openings for deeper learning. Rick and Morty rewards attentive viewing in a way that very few shows do. The production team has consistently seeded episodes with visual jokes, continuity callbacks, hidden references, and details that are easy to miss on a first pass but genuinely enrich the viewing experience when you catch them. This section is about all the things that are hiding in plain sight. If you look carefully at the background of virtually every episode that takes place in deep space or across different dimensions, there is a small pink and blue alien creature that appears consistently. This creature doesn't have a name in canon and is never addressed by any character. It simply exists in the background of interdimensional scenes across multiple seasons. It functions as a kind of visual signature, a Where's Waldo moment for people rewatching episodes. Whether it represents anything meaningful in the lore or is simply a recurring in-joke has never been officially confirmed. In the episode Morty Night Run, which takes place 2 episodes before the Total Recall Parasite episode in Season 2, eagle-eyed viewers can spot Rick loading his trunk with glowing green rocks. Those rocks contain the parasite eggs that will emerge and infect the Smith household 2 episodes later. It's a planted continuity detail that makes the parasite invasion feel less random, as if it were always building. In the same Morty Night Run episode, if you watch a kitchen scene closely, you can see Rick casually tossing some of those same glowing objects away, a detail that only makes sense in retrospect when you realize what those objects were. The show frequently plants seeds like this, details that are meaningless on a first watch and devastatingly clever on a rewatch. A Gravity Falls Easter egg was snuck into the episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. During a sequence where Rick opens multiple portals to shake off pursuing Ricks, one of those portals briefly shows the inside of the Mystery Shack from the Disney XD animated series Gravity Falls. Specifically, you can spot Grunkle Stan's mug, pen, and notebook being sucked into the portal. Both shows were running roughly contemporaneously and both occupied a similar space in the cultural conversation around smart, layered, animated storytelling. The nod felt like one showrunner saluting another. The production animation company Starburns Industries, which animates Rick and Morty, takes its name from Daniel Pooty's character Abed's description of a production assistant named Alex in the show Community. Alex had distinctive sideburns shaped like stars. Starburns Industries was founded by Alex Rubens, who was a writer on Community. The connection between the 2 shows runs all the way down into the name of the studio making the animation. The show uses Toon Boom Harmony for its animation software, while background art is created in Adobe Photoshop. Post-production work is handled in Adobe After Effects. This is a relatively standard pipeline for television animation, but what sets Rick and Morty's visuals apart is the degree of detail and visual variety that the background department achieves within that pipeline. The backgrounds in alien environments are often extraordinarily intricate, filled with visual jokes and details that are visible only for a second or two. Rick almost never wears a seatbelt while traveling in vehicles in the show. Every other character consistently buckles up. It's a tiny behavioral detail that communicates something real about Rick's personality. He considers himself above the ordinary precautions that apply to everyone else. He's also confident enough in his own ability to survive most situations that the statistical value of a seatbelt doesn't register as relevant to him. It's characterization through tiny behavioral detail. The show has a habit of hiding references to episodes that haven't aired yet in earlier episodes. This is especially true in the background visual environment, where props and details from future storylines sometimes appear before their time. The production team is working on multiple episodes simultaneously, and occasionally a detail from an episode in a later stage of production finds its way into an earlier episode's background art before anyone notices. Planet Express, the delivery ship from the Futurama animated series, appears in the background of certain Rick and Morty scenes. Both shows occupy a science fiction universe populated with interstellar travel and alien civilizations, and the visual nod connects 2 Adult Swim-era science fiction comedies. Futurama creator Matt Groening also created The Simpsons, and Simpsons references appear in Rick and Morty as well. The Vat of Acid episode, from Season 4, briefly shows a recognizable bar from The Simpsons in the background. The episode Total Recall, which introduced Mr. Poopy Butthole, contains a visual trick that required the production team to go back and edit him into the episode's opening montage retroactively. The parasites in that episode survive by implanting false memories, and they can only create positive memories. The twist of the episode is whether Mr. Poopy Butthole is real or a parasite. To make his potential authenticity more convincing, the production team inserted him into the intro sequence in a way that made him look like he'd always been a background presence in the show. He was edited into scenes he'd never originally appeared in, a meta-commentary on the episode's central premise about manufactured memories. The evil Morty reveal at the end of the Season 1 episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind is accompanied by a song called For the Damaged Coda by the band Blonde Redhead. The song plays over the reveal scene and has since become so strongly associated with evil Morty that it functions as his unofficial theme music. Every subsequent appearance of Evil Morty in a high-stakes, triumphant context has used the same song. It's become one of the most emotionally loaded pieces of music in the show's entire audio library. In Season 3's The Ricklantis Mix-Up, which is actually an episode set entirely in the Citadel of Ricks rather than in Atlantis, as the misleading title suggests, the closing revelation that President Morty is Evil Morty from Season 1 plays with a reprise of For the Damaged Coda. The song has never been used carelessly. Every time it appears, something enormous is happening in the show's long-form narrative. The harmonious claptrap vanity card that appears at the end of each episode went through a subtle change between Seasons 2 and 3 that tells a story about Dan Harmon's personal life. At the end of Season 2 episodes, the card shows Harmon seated happily with his wife and their pets. At the end of Season 3 episodes, the card shows Harmon alone on a couch, surrounded by pets, vodka bottles, and general disorder. The change reflects his divorce, which was finalized in 2015 after a public separation. It's a very small and very personal piece of real life folded into the show's production history. The show's visual language around portals is not accidental. The swirling green of the portal gun's output is consistently used to represent Rick's mode of travel. But observant fans have noted that when Rick opens portals in emotionally charged situations, the color sometimes shifts slightly, becoming deeper or more unstable. This visual micro-variation was not confirmed in interviews for a long time, and some fans dismissed it as production variance. It remains an open question whether it's intentional characterization or simply the result of multiple artists working on the same visual element across different episodes. Fact 64.5. One of the most quietly impressive technical achievements of the show is the consistency of Rick's laboratory environment across seasons. The Garage Lab has accumulated an enormous amount of visual detail across 7+ seasons of episodes, with new props and machines and artifacts being added regularly, while the overall sense of organized chaos is maintained with remarkable fidelity. This is a production design challenge that requires extensive continuity management across multiple animation teams working on different episodes simultaneously. The fact that the lab feels lived in and consistent rather than generic is a result of that management actually working. The animation style itself is a deliberate choice. The look of Rick and Morty is immediately recognizable, with its specific character proportions, its pastel-adjacent color palette, and the way it alternates between simple expressiveness and surprisingly elaborate detail in alien environments. The aesthetic was developed during the pilot production and has remained remarkably consistent across all seasons, even through the change in voice actors, which represents an impressive degree of visual continuity for a show that has cycled through multiple directors and animation staff over the years. Rick and Morty's characters are among the most carefully constructed in modern animation. Every quirk, every habit, every recurring behavior is there for a reason. Behind the obvious surface traits that make each character immediately recognizable, there are layers of detail that the show has worked in across years of storytelling. Rick Sanchez's drinking is never played purely for comedy. Across the show's run, the writers have approached Rick's alcoholism with more seriousness than viewers initially expect from the context. It's positioned as a genuine coping mechanism, a way of managing emotional pain that Rick would rather suppress than address. The Pickle Rick episode makes this explicit through Dr. Wong's monologue, but smaller moments across earlier episodes, including the way Rick drinks alone in certain late-night scenes, carry a quiet sadness that doesn't need to be underlined. Rick's burping while speaking has a specific narrative function beyond being a vocal quirk. It signals discomfort, evasion, and emotional avoidance in subtle ways across the show. When Rick is being direct and honest, he tends to burp less. When he's deflecting or being manipulative, the burping tends to increase. Fans who have gone back and tracked this correlation across different scenes have found it remarkably consistent, suggesting it was a deliberate character choice rather than an accidental vocal habit. Morty's stammer is not random nervousness. The writers have talked about how Morty's hesitancy in speech reflects genuine cognitive load, the way someone processes a threatening or overwhelming situation by buying their own brain a few extra milliseconds to catch up. As the seasons progress and Morty becomes more experienced with dangerous situations, the stammer appears less frequently in those contexts. In domestic, school-based scenes, it remains. This tracks with how someone might carry anxiety as a baseline condition while developing situational confidence in specific high-stakes environments. Beth Smith's horse surgery career is not incidental. The show uses it to communicate something specific about Beth's character and backstory. Beth was smart enough to become a human surgeon, an actual medical doctor at the top of her field. The fact that she's a horse surgeon instead is a consequence of the choices she made as a young person. Choices that were themselves consequences of Rick's absence from her childhood. She applies her full surgical capability to a setting where those capabilities are both overkill and undervalued. It's a quiet metaphor for her entire situation. Jerry Smith's incompetence is not total. The show has been careful to give Jerry genuine moments of unexpected competence throughout its run. He successfully navigated dangerous situations that more capable characters might have handled worse. He has social instincts that are, in certain specific situations, genuinely useful. His failures tend to come from insecurity-driven overreach rather than from a complete absence of ability. The show uses these flickers of competence to keep Jerry sympathetic rather than purely pathetic. Summer Smith was not originally planned to have as significant a role in the show as she eventually came to occupy. In early development, she was conceived primarily as a background presence, a teenager absorbed in her phone who represented the ordinary domestic world that Rick's adventures interrupted. As the seasons progressed and the writers developed her more fully, she became increasingly central to certain storylines, particularly those dealing with family dynamics and the question of who gets chosen for the adventures and why. Evil Morty was created by Steven Sandoval and Ryan Ridley for his first appearance in Season 1's Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. The character was originally conceived as a one-shot reveal, a twist at the end of an episode exploring the citadel of Ricks. The decision to bring Evil Morty back and make him a recurring force in the show's larger mythology was made later, as the writers recognized how much narrative potential the character represented. Evil Morty's theme song, For the Damaged Coda, by Blonde Redhead, was not commissioned for the show. It's an actual existing piece of music that the sound team licensed because it fit the emotional register of the moment perfectly. The song has an aching electronic quality that suggests both longing and quiet determination. It was the right piece of music for a character who has been stripped of everything normal about a Morty's life and replaced it with cold, patient purpose. Birdperson's original name before the finalization of the show's design was not Birdperson. The character went through several iterations in early development, and the name itself was chosen because of how bluntly descriptive it is. He is a bird person. No title, no species designation, no mysterious alien name. Just the literal observation that he is a person who is a bird. The directness of it was considered funnier and more memorable than any more elaborate name would have been. Mr. Meeseeks, the blue task completion creatures, were inspired partly by the universal human desire to have someone else solve your problems for you. Roiland has talked about wanting to explore what it would actually look and feel like if that desire were fulfilled, what the universe would have to sacrifice in order to give you a perfectly helpful entity that simply does the task and disappears. The answer the show arrives at is that existence itself would be the cost. Something would have to suffer in order for you to have convenient help. That's a darker philosophical conclusion than the episode's comedy might initially suggest. The President of the United States in Rick and Morty is voiced by Keith David, one of the most recognizable voices in American entertainment. Keith David has appeared in films including The Thing, They Live, Pitch Black, and countless others, and has spent decades doing voice work for animation, video games, and documentaries. His deep, authoritative voice gives the President character an immediate gravitas that the show then uses to subvert, because the President in Rick and Morty is ultimately another ego competing with Rick's ego, and Rick consistently refuses to be impressed. Tammy Guterman, the character who betrays Birdperson at their wedding by revealing herself as a Galactic Federation agent, was introduced much earlier in the show's run as simply a teenage girl at Summer's school who became Birdperson's girlfriend. Her casual presence in early episodes, as just a background character in Summer's domestic social world, makes the eventual betrayal much more effective. She was hiding in plain sight for seasons before the reveal landed. Mr. Poopy Butthole's design is deliberately unusual in a specific way. His visual character design doesn't fit neatly into any of the existing aesthetic categories the show uses for its other characters. He doesn't look like a human, he doesn't look like the typical alien characters, and he doesn't look like any specific creature from Earth. He looks like something that exists slightly outside the normal visual grammar of the show. This ambiguity is intentional and is what makes the Parasite episode work. He looks just enough like something that could be a parasite that the audience genuinely isn't sure until the show makes it hurt. The interdimensional cable episodes, where Rick sits the family in front of a television broadcasting from other dimensions and channel surfs through bizarre alien programming, are improvised in a way that's different from anything else in the show. The alien television shows that appear on screen are generally written and performed almost entirely improvised, with minimal scripting. This is intentional, meant to capture the feel of genuinely low-budget, chaotic television from a universe with different entertainment sensibilities. Roiland particularly enjoyed these episodes because they gave him maximum freedom to follow his instincts. Fact 79.5. The show's interdimensional cable episodes created a recurring format that other productions have attempted to emulate, with mixed success. The specific quality that makes the Rick and Morty versions work is the combination of Roiland's improvisational performance ability with writing that establishes each fictional television show's internal logic in about 30 seconds before subverting it. The joke in each fake alien TV show tends to depend on the viewer having accepted some premise that the show quietly, quickly, and completely undermines. The timing required to achieve this across improvised performances is remarkable. Unity, the hive mind that Rick has a romantic relationship with in the Season 2 episode Autoerotic Assimilation, is voiced by Christina Hendricks, best known for playing Joan in Mad Men. The choice of voice for Unity was deliberate. The character needed to feel genuinely warm, genuinely appealing, and genuinely seductive, because the episode's emotional core is about the specific kind of connection Rick is capable of, which is connection with something that doesn't have an individual ego to push back against his. A hive mind can become whatever Rick needs without developing its own needs that conflict with his. It's one of the most quietly devastating portraits of loneliness in the entire show. The production of Rick and Morty is notoriously difficult, famously slow, and deeply chaotic in ways that have occasionally become news stories in their own right. Understanding how the show actually gets made helps explain both its inconsistencies and its remarkable depths. Dan Harmon uses a storytelling framework he developed called the Story Circle, which he has described publicly in multiple interviews and in a behind-the-scenes video released by Adult Swim. The Story Circle is a simplified adaptation of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, condensed into 8 stages arranged in a circle. Harmon applies this framework to every episode and often to individual scenes within episodes. He uses it as a diagnostic tool as much as a generative one, using the circle to identify where a story has gone wrong when it's not working. Harmon has talked about how early in the show's production, he would refuse to send script ideas to artists until he personally felt the scripts were perfect, even if that meant prolonged delays. He recognized this was damaging to the production workflow and eventually adopted a different approach, treating early drafts as a starting point for the animation team rather than a finished product, and accepting that significant revision would happen as the episode was drawn out. This shift in philosophy contributed to the show's more fluid and collaborative production culture in later seasons. Between seasons 2 and 3, the show went on an 18-month hiatus that frustrated fans enormously. The wait was caused by a combination of factors, including the complexity of the stories the writers wanted to tell, ongoing tensions within the production, and Harmon's personal circumstances during that period. When the Season 3 premiere finally aired, it was launched as an April Fool's Day surprise, with Adult Swim streaming the first episode of the season in a continuous loop for 4 hours without any prior announcement. The streams pulled in 3 million unique visitors. The surprise Season 3 premiere broke a record. The Facebook livestream of the same episode got 8.7 million video views on its first day. The combination of pent-up fan hunger and the genuine surprise of the unannounced drop created a viewership moment that felt unprecedented for an Adult Swim show. During production of Season 3, tensions between Harmon and Roiland became significant enough that a professional mediator was brought in to try and manage the relationship between the two creators. The mediation reportedly did not resolve the underlying tensions. Both men have been somewhat guarded about the specifics in public statements, but multiple reports have described a working relationship that was increasingly difficult in the show's later original production period. Roiland's creative involvement declined across Season 3, with reports that he stopped showing up regularly to the production company. During the production of Season 2, Harmon hired several writers from Community, the NBC sitcom he'd previously run. Roiland reportedly felt that this shifted the creative balance in the writer's room in ways that didn't feel right to him. The tension between Harmon's television writing background and Roiland's more instinctive, improvisational approach to the material was a persistent undercurrent throughout their collaboration. Adult Swim renewed Rick and Morty for 70 episodes in 2018. To put that in context, the first 3 seasons of the show consisted of a total of 31 episodes combined. A 70-episode order was effectively committing to more than doubling the show's existing catalog. For Adult Swim, it was an unprecedented expression of confidence in a single property. For the writer's room, it was an enormous pressure of content generation that required significant expansion of the writing staff. The show's visual production is done by a studio called Starburns Industries, which, as previously mentioned, takes its name from a community reference. The animation process for a single episode of Rick and Morty takes many months and involves hundreds of people working across multiple stages. The typical production pipeline for an animated television episode, from script to completed episode, runs at roughly 9 months to a year for a show of Rick and Morty's complexity. This is one of the primary reasons why season gaps between have sometimes been long. The writer's room has employed a system of pitching individual scenes and jokes in which writers are encouraged to pitch the worst, most offensive, most ridiculous version of an idea first, with the understanding that refinement happens later. This is borrowed from a tradition in comedy writing that treats editing as the secondary process and generation as the primary one. Getting the most absurd possible version of an idea out of the room first often helps identify what's genuinely funny about the concept underneath the excess. Female writers were added to the writing room beginning in Season 2, which multiple people connected to the production have credited with meaningfully improving the storylines for Beth and Summer. The show's early seasons had a disproportionately male writing team, which contributed to those characters feeling somewhat underdeveloped compared to Rick, Morty, and Jerry. As the staff became more diverse, the female characters became more fully realized. Between October 2016 and July 2017, Adult Swim aired a series of 16 claymation Rick and Morty shorts during commercial breaks. These were completely separate from the main show, non-canon shorts made with clay animation rather than the show's digital production process. They were extremely brief and extremely strange, and functioned primarily as a way to maintain fan engagement during the long wait between seasons 2 and 3. The show's opening credit sequence changes slightly between seasons in ways that are easy to miss. The sequence itself is familiar, a chaotic montage of interdimensional images set to the show's theme, but the specific images that appear in the montage shift from season to season, often including references to episodes from the upcoming season that haven't aired yet. Watching the opening credits of a new season after you've seen all the episodes is a different experience than watching them before you've seen anything. The show's official companion video game, Pocket Mortys, was developed by Big Pixel Studios and published by Adult Swim Games. It's a mobile game that uses the collecting and battling mechanics of Pokemon games, but populates them with the many variants of Morty from across the multiverse. The game has been updated with new content over several years and maintains an active player base. It's a fairly rare example of an animated show tie-in game that has lasted and maintained genuine engagement rather than fading quickly. The show has received considerable academic attention. Multiple university courses have used Rick and Morty episodes as teaching materials for philosophy, specifically for topics including personal identity, ethics, nihilism, and the philosophy of mind. The show's willingness to engage with genuinely difficult philosophical questions in accessible, emotionally grounded ways makes it a useful classroom text even for students who have never thought of an animated comedy as philosophically serious. Fact 94. 5. The show has been noted by animation professionals for the quality of its lip syncing, which tends to be more expressive and responsive to the actual audio than is typical for American television animation. This is partly a function of the amount of improvisation in the performances, which means the animation team is working to match audio that wasn't written to fall on predictable beats. The result is character mouth movements that feel more alive and spontaneous than the standard. Dan Harmon hosts a podcast called Harmontown that ran from 2012 to 2019. The podcast documented much of the real-world chaos of Harmon's creative and personal life during the Rick and Morty years, including his divorce and various professional conflicts. For fans interested in understanding the human context behind the show's production, Harmontown provides an unusually raw and intimate window into one of its creators' inner world during the periods when the show was at its most productive. There is no single real-world story about Rick and Morty more bizarre, more instructive about the show's cultural power, or more genuinely hard to believe than the Szechuan sauce story. It starts as a joke. It ends with police at McDonald's restaurants across America, and it tells you everything you need to know about the kind of fandom this show created. The Szechuan sauce referenced in Rick and Morty was a real product. McDonald's originally released a Szechuan dipping sauce for Chicken McNuggets as a limited promotional tie-in for the 1998 Disney animated film Mulan. The sauce was available for a short period, disappeared when the promotion ended, and spent nearly 2 decades as an obscure memory in the minds of people who tried it in 1998. McDonald's had essentially no plans to ever revive it. That was about to change. The Season 3 premiere episode, The Rick Shank Redemption, which aired as a surprise on April Fool's Day in 2017, ended with Rick delivering a monologue about his obsessive desire to taste the McDonald's Szechuan sauce again. The speech is framed as Rick's declaration that his entire series arc is driven by finding that sauce. The line was improvised by Roiland in the recording session and kept because it was both hilarious and strangely resonant as a piece of absurdist motivational rhetoric. Within days of the episode airing, fans had launched a Change.org petition calling for McDonald's to bring back the Szechuan sauce. The petition gathered tens of thousands of signatures very quickly. McDonald's corporate monitored the social media reaction and made the decision to engage. A corporate McDonald's chef publicly stated on Twitter that he would, quote, see what he could do. McDonald's sent co-creators Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon a private stash of the recreated Szechuan sauce, along with a note written in a deliberately in-universe style. The note included fictional explanations for how McDonald's in the Rick and Morty universe had come across the sauce, rather than simply acknowledging they'd made a fresh batch. It was a corporate PR move that showed genuine understanding of the show's sensibility, playing along with the fiction rather than breaking it. On the 1st of October 2017, McDonald's officially confirmed via Twitter that the Szechuan sauce would return for one day only on the 7th of October 2017. The announcement was framed as a limited promotional event connected to the premiere of Rick and Morty Season 3's regular run. Fans immediately began planning their trips to McDonald's. The 7th of October 2017 event was a disaster of almost legendary proportions. McDonald's had wildly underestimated both the demand and the intensity of the fanbase's response. Only a handful of select locations received sauce at all, and those locations received tiny amounts. Fans who drove hours to get the sauce, in some cases crossing state lines, arrived to find restaurants that had run out within minutes of opening or that hadn't received any sauce at all. The scenes at McDonald's restaurants on October 7 and 8, 2017 required police attendance at multiple locations. Fans were furious. There was chanting, there was confrontation with staff, there were incidents that resulted in local news coverage. Someone traded their car for a single packet of the sauce. A few packets appeared on eBay within hours, with starting bids exceeding $1,000. One sealed lot of 3 packets sold for nearly $850. McDonald's released a public statement acknowledging that they had failed to anticipate, in their words, the overnight crowds, the cross-state travel, and the amazing curiosity, passion, and energy fans showed. They committed to bringing the sauce back properly. On the 26th of February 2018, McDonald's distributed 20 million packets of Szechuan sauce to every McDonald's location across the United States simultaneously, successfully meeting demand this time and providing one of the stranger happy endings in the history of food promotional campaigns. The Szechuan sauce event had a secondary effect on Rick and Morty's public perception. In the aftermath of the October 7 chaos, there was significant media coverage that portrayed Rick and Morty fans as entitled and disruptive. This narrative contributed to a broader conversation about the show's fanbase that was often unflattering, creating a stereotype that the show and its creators had to navigate for some time afterward. Justin Roiland, during the Hurricane Harvey disaster in September 2017, called Houston televangelist Joel Osteen's prayer line in character as Rick. Osteen's church had initially been reluctant to open its doors as a shelter, which drew widespread criticism. Roiland made the call and recorded it, and it was widely shared online. The moment demonstrated how thoroughly Roiland had inhabited Rick as a character. Even in a completely unscripted, real-world context, The voice and persona emerged instinctively. The show spawned an entire industry of licensed merchandise that expanded remarkably quickly after Season 3. Funko Pop vinyl figures, clothing, accessories, posters, phone cases, and eventually high-end collectibles created a revenue stream around the show that significantly exceeded what Adult Swim typically generated from merchandise for its animated properties. The Szechuan sauce moment accelerated this by introducing the show to millions of people who hadn't been watching. Rick and Morty's cultural influence reached a point where it began appearing as a reference point in academic and journalistic discussions of internet culture, fandom, and the behavior of online communities. Articles and publications ranging from Wired to The Atlantic to academic journals examined the show's fan base as a case study in parasocial relationships, community identity formation, and the dynamics of cult media. For a show that started as an adult cartoon with modest premiere ratings, this level of cultural analysis was striking. In 2019, Funko released a Pickle Rick figure that became one of the top-selling Funko Pop designs of that year. The Pickle Rick episode had by that point become so culturally embedded that it functioned almost independently of the rest of the show. People who had never watched a single episode of Rick and Morty knew what Pickle Rick was. It became one of those shorthand cultural references that travels far beyond the fan base that originally created its context. The Simpsons dedicated an entire couch gag, which is the brief animated sequence shown before each episode of that show, to Rick and Morty. The gag featured Rick and Morty invading the Simpsons universe in their ship, messing with the fundamental nature of the Simpsons animated reality, and generally causing chaos before departing. It was a significant honor from one of the longest-running and most celebrated animated television properties in history. Fact 109.5. The influence of Rick and Morty on internet culture extends to its role in popularizing certain kinds of nihilistic and ironic humor that became a recognizable mode of online communication in the late 2010s. The show's particular blend of genuine emotional depth wrapped inside elaborate dismissiveness and performed indifference gave a name and a shape to a form of emotional expression that many young people recognized from their own inner lives. The gap between the sincerity underneath and the irony on the surface was something the show both described and modeled. Lifetime to date, as of data from around the Season 6 premiere period, Rick and Morty had been viewed over 10 billion times globally across linear television, digital platforms, and streaming services. 10 billion. That number encompasses rewatches, streaming, on-demand, and linear broadcast. But even as an order of magnitude, it places the show in the company of only the most viewed media properties on the planet. Rick and Morty has built one of the most elaborate and carefully maintained fictional mythologies in animated television. The lore of the show rewards sustained attention in ways that become more apparent as seasons accumulate. What looks like chaos on the surface has, underneath it, a surprisingly coherent philosophical architecture. The Central Finite Curve, which became one of the show's most important lore concepts, was first mentioned in passing in the Season 1 episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. The brief throwaway mention meant nothing at the time. It took 7 more years and 41 more episodes before the canonical explanation of what the Central Finite Curve actually is was delivered. Patience in storytelling of this kind is rare in television. The Central Finite Curve, as explained in the Season 5 finale Rick Mirai Jack, is a deliberate barrier separating the infinite multiverse into 2 sections. On one side are all the universes in which Rick Sanchez exists and is the smartest being alive. On the other side is everything else, all the universes where Rick either doesn't exist or isn't the dominant intelligence. The Ricks built the curve themselves to ensure that within their section of the multiverse, they would always be on top. They caged a portion of infinity to make themselves feel secure. Evil Morty understood the Central Finite Curve before almost anyone else in the show recognized its significance. His entire long-game strategy, from his first appearance in Season 1 through his presidency of the Citadel and the final escape in the Season 5 finale, was designed to access the Citadel's dimensional drive technology and use it to punch a hole through the curve. He didn't want to rule. He wanted to leave. He wanted to exist in a universe where the game wasn't rigged from the start. The Central Finite Curve was restored relatively quickly in Season 6 by a race of hyper-intelligent dinosaurs who visited Earth and casually fixed the rift as a side task. Rick was visibly irritated by this because the rift in the curve represented a significant narrative opportunity for the show, and the dinosaurs simply patched it without understanding or caring about its significance to the story. It was a deliberately meta moment, acknowledging that the whole evil Morty had blown through the show's central premise had been stitched closed again. Rick C-137 is a specific designation, not a generic label. The C-137 refers to a specific dimension of origin. Rick Sanchez from dimension C-137 is the Rick who is considered by the show to be the one true main character's grandfather. But the timeline of exactly how Rick C-137 arrived at his current situation is one of the show's most carefully constructed mysteries, one that began being addressed directly in Season 6 and 7. Rick Prime, the version of Rick who killed Rick C-137's wife Diane and his original daughter Beth, was introduced as a backstory element in Season 6. Rick Prime is the Rick who was responsible for giving C-137's Rick his first portal gun, which led to C-137 Rick's own scientific awakening. And Rick Prime is also the Rick who, when confronted with C-137's grief and rage after killing his family, simply left. The relationship between the two Ricks is one of the show's darkest and most emotionally complex threads. The fan theory called the ticket theory has been acknowledged by the creators without being fully confirmed or denied. The theory proposes that the Rick and Morty we follow in certain episodes are not the same Rick and Morty we follow in others, that a dimension swap happened quietly mid-series when Rick picked up a Jerrybury ticket with a specific number that matches a number on another Rick's ticket in a different scene. The theory is internally consistent with the evidence on screen. Whether it's intentional or a production continuity error has never been officially resolved. The Citadel of Ricks, the society built by thousands of different Rick variants across the multiverse, is designed as a deliberate mirror of real-world social stratification. Within the Citadel, there are wealthy Ricks and poor Ricks, powerful Ricks and exploited ones. The Mortys within the Citadel attend a school called Morty School, where they are explicitly trained to be good sidekicks rather than independent thinkers. The social commentary is not subtle, but it's intelligent and consistent. The episode The Rick-Lantis Mix-Up, which airs while the main Rick and Morty are supposedly in Atlantis and follows instead the Citadel election storyline, is widely considered by critics and fans to be one of the finest episodes the show has ever produced. Its structure, cutting between multiple simultaneous Citadel storylines rather than following a single narrative thread, is unusual for the show and executed with remarkable precision. The ending, revealing that the newly elected President Morty is evil Morty, is one of the show's most effective dramatic reveals. Rick's wife Diane, whose death drives the show's most emotionally significant backstory, appears in a very small number of scenes across the show's run and has never been developed as fully as some fans would like. What the show reveals about her is deliberate in its sparseness. We know she was warm, we know Rick loved her completely, we know her loss broke something fundamental in him that he has never repaired. The restraint with which the show handles her memory actually amplifies its emotional weight rather than diminishing it. The show's most explicit statement about Rick's grief comes in the Season 6 episode Analyze Piss, which functions on its surface as a callback to earlier themes of Rick's invulnerability before revealing in its final moments how thoroughly the loss of Diane and the hunt for Rick Prime have defined everything Rick has done. The reveal recontextualizes behavior from much earlier in the show's run. That kind of long-game recontextualization, where new information fundamentally changes how you understand things you saw 3 or 4 seasons ago, is something Rick and Morty does better than almost any other animated series. The show has been deliberately inconsistent about whether it has a true canon or not. In the early seasons, the premise of the infinite multiverse was used as a reason to avoid long-term continuity. If any version of any event could be happening in some dimension, then nothing needed to matter. But as the seasons progressed, the show increasingly committed to a specific narrative about a specific Rick and Morty, building genuine consequences and lasting emotional weight. The tension between those two approaches, nihilistic dispensability and meaningful consequence, is one of the show's most interesting, ongoing creative negotiations. Rick's catchphrase, which famously includes the phrase about the way the news goes, is not just a verbal tick. In context, it's Rick's way of avoiding emotional sincerity by wrapping it in performed nihilism. When Rick says the phrase, he's usually redirecting away from a moment that has gotten emotionally close to something real. The phrase functions as a verbal escape hatch, a way to deflect genuine feeling into meaningless sound. The show uses it with precision, placing it at moments when Rick is most at risk of showing that he actually cares. The butter robot, a small robot created by Rick in an early episode purely to pass the butter at the dinner table, gained enormous fan attention because of the robot's brief, devastating existential crisis upon learning its sole purpose. After Rick explains that the robot's purpose is to pass butter, the robot looks down at itself and says, "What is my purpose?" Rick says, "You pass butter." The robot stares and says, "Oh my God." This brief exchange has been called one of the best distillations of existential philosophy in pop culture. It took approximately 20 seconds of screen time. The show's running depiction of a plumbus, a completely fictional alien domestic appliance whose function and use are described in great and bewildering detail but never actually clarified, became one of its most beloved recurring absurdist gags. The plumbus segments are constructed to sound exactly like the kind of earnest educational explainer content you'd expect from a legitimate product demonstration, which makes the complete incoherence of what's being described all the funnier. It's a precise parody of explanation that reveals nothing by explaining everything. Rick and Morty has not only achieved massive viewership numbers, it has reshaped conversations about what adult animation is capable of and has left a measurable mark on the broader entertainment industry. The awards, the records, and the industry influence tell a story about a show that arrived at the right moment with the right voice. Rick and Morty won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program in 2018 for its Pickle Rick episode. This was historic. It was the first time an Adult Swim comedy had won a Primetime Emmy Award. Adult Swim had been on the air since 2001 and had produced a remarkable number of beloved and innovative shows. That none of them had won a Primetime Emmy before Rick and Morty illustrates both how thoroughly the Emmy category had historically favored mainstream broadcast animation and how much the show had pushed past that boundary. The show won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, a second time in 2020 for its episode One Crew Over the Cuckoo's Morty, a heist movie parody episode from Season 4. Winning the award twice in 3 years placed Rick and Morty in the company of animation achievements that had previously been associated primarily with The Simpsons and Futurama. Season 3 of Rick and Morty produced the highest ratings in Adult Swim's entire network history when it aired in 2017. The season finale drew a 3.9 rating in the adults 18 to 24 demographic and a 3.2 rating in adults 18 to 34. It was the most watched cable telecast of the day across both of those demographics, beating everything else on cable television that Sunday. For a late-night animated comedy on a network primarily associated with stoner humor and experimental programming, those numbers were historically anomalous. When Season 3 premiered with its surprise April Fool's Day drop in 2017, the episode was streamed in a continuous loop for 4 hours. The streams generated 3 million unique visitors. The Facebook live stream of the same episode generated 8.7 million video views in a single day. These numbers, for a cable network's animated programming, were the kind of engagement metrics that were previously associated only with the largest broadcast tentpole events. Overall viewership for Season 3 was up 81% compared to Season 2, despite or perhaps partly because of the 18-month gap between seasons. Pent-up demand combined with the genuine quality and ambition of the Season 3 storylines created a viewership surge that significantly increased the show's already large audience. By Season 3, Rick and Morty had become the most popular comedy on American television among adults in the 18 to 24 and 18 to 34 demographics, outperforming The Big Bang Theory and Modern Family among younger viewers. The show's gender demographics are more balanced than outside observers typically assume. According to Hulu viewership data from the show's earlier seasons, the gender split among Rick and Morty viewers was approximately 60% male and 40% female. That 40% female viewership figure was notably higher than the stereotype of the show's audience suggested, and the creators have pointed to it as one of the reasons they invested in developing Beth and Summer more fully as the show progressed. Rick and Morty's 70-episode renewal in 2018 represented the largest episode commitment Adult Swim had ever made to a single show. Previous Adult Swim renewals had typically been in the range of 10 to 20 episodes at a time. 70 episodes was a show of confidence that also reflected the network's understanding that the writer's room needed a stable, long-term framework within which to develop the complex storytelling arcs they were building toward. The show has been renewed beyond the original 70-episode order. Dan Harmon confirmed during Season 7's run that he and showrunner Scott Marder were already developing plans for Season 9, with the network having committed to, at minimum, a Season 10. This means Rick and Morty, as of the current writing era, is confirmed to continue through at least its 10th season, making it one of the longest-running animated series in Adult Swim's history. Rick and Morty has inspired an officially licensed anime adaptation titled Rick and Morty, the anime, produced by the Japanese animation studio Telecom Animation Film. The anime was developed by Takashi Sano, an animator who had previously created fan animations of Rick and Morty characters that went viral and caught the attention of Adult Swim. The official anime version premiered in 2024. This makes Rick and Morty one of the very rare American animated properties to generate an official Japanese anime adaptation, rather than the other way around. The show has inspired academic papers in philosophy journals addressing specific episodes and the philosophical positions they articulate or dramatize. This is not unique in the history of animated television, as shows including The Simpsons and Futurama have similarly inspired academic engagement. But the volume and frequency of Rick and Morty citations in academic philosophical literature, particularly around topics like personal identity, moral realism, and nihilism, is unusual for a show of its vintage. The show's co-creation by Dan Harmon has been cited as influential on a generation of television writers who studied Harmon's story circle methodology through publicly available documents and videos. The story circle has been adopted as a storytelling framework by writers working across television, film, video games, and interactive media. Harmon himself has commented with some ambivalence about seeing his specific framework propagated so widely, noting that the risk of any structural methodology is that it becomes a cage rather than a compass. Rick and Morty's influence on the broader adult animation landscape is measurable in the number of animated shows that emerged in the years following its breakout, Season 3, that attempted to replicate its specific combination of irreverent comedy, science fiction premises, and genuine emotional depth. Shows including Disenchantment, Solar Opposites, and several others have been described as occupying Rick and Morty's shadow, benefiting from an audience appetite that the show helped create. The show's social media presence has been consistently extraordinary. At its peak during Season 3, the official Rick and Morty accounts had millions of followers across multiple platforms, with engagement rates that dramatically outperformed most entertainment properties of comparable size. The fandom's activity online, including fan art, fan theories, episode analyses, and character discussion, has kept the show's social media presence energized across the full decade-plus span of its existence. Rick and Morty merchandise has achieved the rare status of crossing over from fan-oriented specialty retail into mainstream retail environments. Items including Funko figures, shirts, and accessories have been stocked in major chains including Target, Walmart, and Hot Topic, which indicates a mainstream cultural penetration well beyond what the show's demographic profile would initially suggest. Fact 139.5. The show's licensing agreements across streaming platforms have been notably complex, reflecting the show's enormous value as a streaming property. Netflix has carried the show internationally in certain markets, while HBO Max and eventually Max have held domestic streaming rights in the United States. The multi-platform availability of the show across different regions has contributed to its global viewership numbers being genuinely difficult to track comprehensively because the data lives in multiple proprietary systems. The 10 billion views figure is likely a conservative estimate given the accounting difficulties. The show's opening theme, composed by Ryan Elder, was originally written for a completely different project. Elder composed the theme for another of Roiland's animated concepts, and when that project didn't move forward, the music was adapted for Rick and Morty. Elder has said the composition process for adapting the theme involved finding the specific emotional register that captured both the show's comic chaos and its underlying melancholy. The result, that rolling electronic theme with its slightly warped and woozy quality, has become one of the most recognizable pieces of opening music in animated television. Each season of Rick and Morty has its own specific character, its own creative preoccupations, and its own collection of behind-the-scenes stories that illuminate how the show operates and changes. Walking through the seasons reveals a picture of a show in constant creative negotiation with itself. Season 1 of Rick and Morty contains 11 episodes and was produced very quickly by animation standards. The first season was essentially a proof of concept, establishing the show's world, its characters, its tone, and its willingness to go to genuinely dark places without losing its comedic core. Several first-season episodes, including Me Seeks and Destroy and Rick's Minutes, immediately demonstrated the show's range by sitting entirely different genres of comedy and emotional register next to each other within a single episode. The first-season episode Rick Potion, number 9, in which Rick's love potion accidentally turns the entire population of Earth into horrifying Cronenberg mutations, ends with one of the most devastating sequences the show ever aired in its first season. Rick and Morty bury their own dead bodies in the backyard of the alternate dimension they've fled to and move into the lives of versions of themselves that have just died. The episode simply ends there. No resolution, no catharsis, just the fact of what they've done, sitting in silence. For a first-season episode of any television show, let alone an animated comedy, it was an extraordinarily bold ending. Season 2 was produced under significantly more pressure than Season 1, with the success of the first season raising expectations considerably. The season contains 10 episodes and features some of the show's most emotionally ambitious storytelling. The Season 2 finale, the Wedding Squanchers episode that kills Birdperson, represents the show committing fully to long-form consequence. After that episode, the show could never quite retreat to a simpler version of itself. The Season 2 episode Look Who's Purging Now is a parody of the 2013 horror film The Purge, but it develops into something much stranger and darker. The episode features Rick and Morty landing on a planet that observes an annual purge of violence. The episode's twist is that rather than critiquing violence as the film does, it critiques Rick and Morty's own casual relationship to violence, having Morty discover that he's capable of taking real pleasure in carnage under the right circumstances. It's one of the show's most uncomfortable episodes to sit with. Season 3 premiered with the surprise April Fool's Day drop of its first episode, The Rick Shank Redemption, which is largely set inside the Galactic Federation's prison system, where Rick was captured at the end of Season 2. The episode delivers a significant and recontextualizing backstory dump inside Rick's mind, while simultaneously being extremely funny. The Szechuan sauce monologue that ends the episode was largely improvised by Roiland and has never been fully scripted. The transcript that was eventually reconstructed from the audio doesn't precisely match what's in the episode. The Pickle Rick episode, which aired as the third episode of Season 3, became the show's single most recognizable episode and eventually its Emmy-winning signature piece. The premise, Rick turning himself into a pickle to avoid family therapy, is simple enough to explain in one sentence. The execution of that premise, which involves Rick engineering an escape from a sewer using only his intelligence and a collection of insects and rats, and which ends with a devastating therapy session, is anything but simple. Season 3 included an episode called The ABCs of Beth, which directly addresses Beth's childhood and the question of whether she may have had violent impulses that Rick helped her act on by building her elaborate toys that were actually weapons. The episode raises the possibility that Beth is not simply a woman constrained by poor life choices, but someone who shares some of Rick's most dangerous qualities. The episode doesn't fully resolve this question, leaving it as an open and slightly disturbing ambiguity. Season 3's finale, The Rick Churi and Morty Date, pits Rick against the President of the United States in a battle of egos that functions as a comedic meditation on authority and ego. The voice of the President in this episode is Keith David. The episode ends with a status quo reset that was somewhat divisive among fans, who felt the season's emotional arcs deserved a more significant payoff. The episode's low-key ending was a deliberate choice by the writers, who wanted to subvert the expectation of a dramatic season finale. Season 4 arrived after a 2-year gap between seasons, which was the longest gap between any 2 consecutive seasons. The season was split into 2 halves, with the first 5 episodes airing in late 2019 and the remaining 5 airing in May 2020. The split release was unusual for the show and reflected both production realities and Adult Swim's evolving approach to deploying its most valuable content. The second half of Season 4 aired during the early period of the global pandemic, giving viewers who were stuck at home a welcome distraction. Season 4's episode, The Vat of Acid episode, in which Rick creates a device that allows Morty to generate save points in real life, won the show its second Emmy Award. The episode is a precise and devastating examination of how the ability to undo consequences changes a person's relationship with their choices. Morty's use of the save point device to recklessly move through a series of experiences, culminating in a real emotional connection he then deletes, is one of the show's most heartbreaking sequences. Season 5 began with the episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre, which opens with a brief scene from the original Doc and Marty short film, displayed as if Rick is watching it on a crystal in the garage. The scene is presented matter-of-factly, without comment, as a kind of private in-joke that acknowledges the show's own history to the most attentive viewers. Season 5's Rickman Jack episode, the finale, contains the canonical explanation of the Central Finite Curve and Evil Morty's escape from it. The episode is named after the Kurosawa film Yojimbo and its Clint Eastwood remake A Fistful of Dollars, with Rick taking on a Ronin-like role in the Citadel's final chaos. The visual and tonal influences of Japanese samurai cinema and spaghetti westerns are visible throughout the episode's structure. Season 5's finale, Rick Mirai Jack, ends with Evil Morty's escape from the Central Finite Curve in a sequence that uses a piece of music called Evil Morty's Theme in a final, triumphant key, before the screen goes dark and he simply moves on. The show resisted the urge to give Evil Morty a villain's speech or a dramatic final confrontation. He just leaves. The lack of theatrical resolution is part of what makes it so effective. Season 6 premiered in September 2022 and explicitly addressed the aftermath of Evil Morty's destruction of the Central Finite Curve by opening with Rick and Morty stranded on a broken piece of the Citadel, unable to use their portal guns because the portal fluid has been destabilized. The season's first episode, Solarix, performs a reset of the portal gun's connection to each traveler's home dimension, which generates its own complications and reveals. It's a precise and methodical way of acknowledging that the previous season's events had real structural consequences. Season 6 introduced Rick Prime as a direct antagonist, in a way the show had been building towards since early references to Rick's backstory. Rick Prime is presented as genuinely menacing, in a way that few antagonists in the show have been, partly because his motivations are opaque in a manner that suggests deeply considered cruelty rather than comprehensible evil. Rick C-137's rage toward Rick Prime is one of the most emotionally grounded things the show has ever depicted, because it's rooted in grief that is specific and real. Season 7 began without Justin Roiland and featured Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden in the title roles. The creative team made the decision to address the transition with a brief, self-aware joke in the first episode's promotional materials, while treating the actual episodes as if the change had always been true, not drawing attention to the new voices within the narrative. This approach proved largely effective, with most viewers adapting to the new performances within the first few episodes. Season 7 featured Unmortrican, an episode widely praised as one of the finest single episodes in the show's run, in which Rick finally confronts Rick Prime. The episode delivers the emotional payoff of Rick's long revenge arc, while simultaneously complicated it by involving Evil Morty in ways that neither Rick expected. The episode's emotional weight is considerable, and its willingness to move rapidly through plot developments that would take other shows multiple seasons to reach is characteristic of the show at its most confident. Season 7 of Rick and Morty actually performed strongly in ratings, despite the change in lead voices, confirming that the show's audience had not abandoned it following the Roiland departure. The season was received positively by critics who had been cautious about whether the recasting could work, with several reviewers noting that the transition was smoother than many had feared. The Season 7 episode A Rick in King Mortar's Mort, a parody of Arthurian legend, was widely regarded as one of the funniest episodes of the season. It demonstrated that the show's comedic engine, its ability to take a specific cultural reference point and run it through the show's particular brand of absurdist logic, remained fully functional with the new cast in place. Fact 159.5. The show's willingness to parody specific film genres within individual episodes, while maintaining its own internal emotional logic throughout, has been one of its most technically impressive creative achievements. The Ricklantis mix-up is structured like a Robert Altman ensemble film. The Vat of Acid episode draws structural elements from multiple film traditions simultaneously. The Season 3 premiere is half jailbreak movie and half memory-based psychological drama. The show wears its cinematic influences visibly while never losing the thread of its own identity, which is a considerable balancing act. Season 8 of Rick and Morty was confirmed and is in production, continuing the show's renewal commitment beyond the original 70-episode order. The season is expected to continue storylines introduced in Season 7, while also introducing new premises and characters. Dan Harmon has described the writing team's approach as increasingly comfortable with long-form serialization alongside standalone adventures, a balance that reflects the show's evolving relationship with its own mythology. For the deep fans, the ones who have watched every episode multiple times and spend time in the forums and subreddits piecing together connections across seasons, Rick and Morty operates on an additional level of meaning that casual viewers never access. This section is for those people, and for anyone who wants to understand what that level of engagement looks like. The show has a recurring background character in certain crowd scenes who is identifiably based on the appearance of former Adult Swim executive Mike Lazo, who played a significant role in the network's creative development for many years. The character is not named or addressed but appears in crowd scenes across multiple seasons. It's the kind of inside joke that probably passes unnoticed by most viewers, but would get a significant laugh in the right room. Rick's laboratory in the garage contains a framed photograph that has been the subject of fan speculation across multiple seasons. The image is partially obscured in most shots but appears to show a family that doesn't quite match the Smith family, which has led to theories about whose photograph it is and what it might reveal about Rick's emotional connection to a lost family unit. Whether this is intentional characterization or a background detail that was never meant to be examined this closely is unknown. In the show's early seasons, several episode titles contain subtle anagram or wordplay elements that connect thematically to their episode's contents. The show's writers have talked about enjoying the tradition of loaded episode titles that mean more than they initially appear to. The 60 Minutes episode title, which sounds like a simple reference to the interdimensional cable concept, contains within it the suggestion of risky and mixed, which both apply to the episode's themes of alternate lives and the choices we make. The character of Scary Terry, the Freddy Krueger parody, has a name that is itself a joke. Freddy Krueger was played by Robert Englund. Terry is a variant of the name Derek, which is a common name in English-speaking countries. The combination of scary and the very ordinary name Terry is doing the same kind of comedic work that names like Jerry, Beth, and Morty do throughout the show, using the aggressively ordinary to undercut or counterbalance something extraordinary. The show uses a specific color of teal green for all things connected to Rick's scientific apparatus that is consistent enough to function as a visual signature. His portal gun, his portal fluid, the glow of his garage laboratory equipment, the color of alien tech that he has created or modified. When that specific shade appears in a scene, it indicates Rick's presence or influence even when Rick himself is not on screen. The episode Meeseeks and Destroy features a brief moment where a Mr. Meeseeks, after completing a task, takes a tiny bow before disappearing. This small, courteous gesture was not in the script. The animation team added it as a character flourish, and it stuck. That bow appears whenever a Meeseeks completes its task on time, without complications in subsequent episodes. It's a tiny piece of character consistency maintained by the animation team across multiple seasons. The show has a recurring motif of characters breaking down and crying in scenes that begin as comedic. The emotional pivot from comedy to genuine distress happens with a specific visual grammar, a slight softening of the animation style, a change in the music score, a slowing of the editing rhythm. The show has trained its audience to recognize this pivot as meaningful rather than arbitrary, which gives the emotional beats genuine impact rather than feeling like tonal whiplash. In the episode Total Recall, the family eventually figures out that the way to identify real people from parasites is to find a bad memory involving that person. The show briefly shows us bad memories associated with Rick, Jerry, and Beth. The bad memory associated with Beth is her throwing a hot iron at young Morty. This is presented quickly and with dark comedy, but it's a revealing character moment that suggests Beth's relationship with her children is more complicated and more fraught than the surface version of her character would indicate. The Interdimensional Criminal Federation, which serves as a recurring institutional antagonist across multiple seasons, is depicted with a visual aesthetic that deliberately evokes both imperial science fiction villains and corporate bureaucracies. The production design of Federation spaces uses blues and silver tones, rather than the greens and browns associated with Rick's improvised aesthetic. The color coding is consistent enough to function as a visual shorthand for institutional power versus individual ingenuity. The show's music supervisor, Ryan Elder, has created what fans have come to think of as the sonic vocabulary of Rick and Morty, a collection of musical motifs that appear across episodes and carry specific emotional weight. The use of synth-driven, slightly retro electronic music for action sequences contrasts with acoustic, minimal compositions for emotional scenes. This sonic contrast is one of the ways the show creates the sensation of rapid tonal shifts without those shifts feeling jarring. Mr. Poopy Butthole's post-credit scenes across seasons 2 and 3 were used as a meta-device for the production team to communicate with fans about hiatus lengths. In the season 2 post-credit scene, Mr. Poopy Butthole is shown recovering from being shot, and he tells the audience that the wait for season 3 will be a long time. In the season 3 post-credit scene, a different and more advanced Mr. Poopy Butthole character appears, suggesting another long wait ahead. These scenes function as both narrative grace notes for the character and honest communications to the audience about what to expect. The show has a background extra in several crowd scenes, who appears to be wearing a shirt with a logo that references a fictional band called Flesh Curtains, which is mentioned in the show's dialogue as a band that Rick played in with Birdperson and Squanchy during their rebellious youth. This detail exists in the show's background before it's ever referenced in dialogue. One of those cases where the background art department was working ahead of the writers or was given access to future episode plans and incorporated them into the visual environment early. The character Jessica, Morty's long-running crush from school, has appeared across multiple seasons with varying degrees of significance, but has consistently served as a grounding reminder of the ordinary teenage life that Morty is being pulled away from. Her presence in an episode is usually a signal that the show wants to remind you who Morty is when the interdimensional chaos isn't happening. She represents the life Morty could theoretically have if Rick weren't in it. The show's use of the color red for moments of extreme danger or violence is consistent enough to function as a visual warning. Explosions, blood, extreme threat all tend to appear in contexts where the red values in the scene are elevated relative to the show's normal palette. It's not an absolute rule, but it's consistent enough that attentive viewers begin to register the color shift at a subconscious level as a signal of escalation. Fact 174.5. The show has a tradition of naming minor background Ricks in ways that reflect specific personality types or life choices. Fans have cataloged dozens of these named variants across Citadel episodes and other multidimensional settings. The names tend to be descriptive in the bluntest possible way, which is consistent with the show's general approach to the Citadel as a place where individuality has been flattened into variation on a single theme. Every Rick thinks he's unique. Most of them are variations on the same few archetypes. The Simpsons crossover couch gag, which featured Rick and Morty crashing into the Simpsons universe, was animated by Rick and Morty's production team rather than by the Simpsons' own animation department. The quality difference in the crossover segment, where the Simpsons characters move with Rick and Morty-style fluidity and expressiveness, is noticeable to anyone familiar with both shows. The crossover functions not only as a tribute but as an implicit argument for the animation style. Strip away the portal guns and the interdimensional cable and the pickle transformations and the sauce riots, and what you find at the core of Rick and Morty is a show that has been grappling seriously with a cluster of philosophical questions that matter. Questions about nihilism, meaning, connection, the burden of intelligence, the cost of love, and what it means to be a person in a universe that has no particular interest in your well-being. This final section is about what the show has been saying, underneath all the noise. Rick's nihilism is not presented by the show as philosophically correct. This is one of the most important things to understand about how Rick and Morty actually works. Rick believes the universe is meaningless, that love is a chemical process, that connection is temporary, and that intelligence is the only real currency. The show consistently places emotional evidence against those positions. Morty's courage matters. Beth's love matters. Birdperson's loyalty matters. Mr. Poopy Butthole's warmth matters. The show knows Rick is wrong, even when it lets him perform being right. The show uses the concept of infinite possibilities not to argue that nothing matters, but to argue that the things you choose to make matter are your act of creation in a universe that offers no guidance. This is essentially the philosophical position of existentialism, the idea that meaning is not found but made, and that the fact of its being made doesn't diminish it. Rick can dismiss this view all he wants. The show keeps demonstrating it through the behavior of people around him. Fact 177.5. The show has a deep and largely unspoken relationship with the concept of inherited trauma, the idea that the psychological damage sustained in one generation ripples forward into the next. Rick's damage from the loss of Diane and his original Beth flowed into his abandonment of Beth, which flowed into Beth's insecure marriage and overinvestment in Rick's approval, which flows into Morty and Summer's complicated navigation of a family system built on unresolved grief and unhealed wounds. The show tracks this chain of consequence across characters with a fidelity that feels more like literary fiction than animation. No one in the Smith family is suffering in isolation. Everyone is suffering in response to something that happened before them, and in ways that will affect whatever comes after. Rick's relationship with Morty is the show's central argument against nihilism. Rick cannot fully commit to the belief that nothing matters because he cannot be fully indifferent to Morty. In the moments when Morty is genuinely threatened, Rick's behavior shifts in ways that reveal a care he would never articulate. The show has been careful to make these moments specific and earned rather than generic. Rick doesn't simply love everyone. He loves Morty. That specificity makes it real. The show's exploration of the multiverse carries an implicit ethical question that it returns to repeatedly. If there are infinite versions of every person and every event, what is the moral weight of any particular version? If Morty dies in one dimension but lives in infinite others, has anyone been harmed? The show's answer, which it arrives at through Morty's own experience of grief and loss, and through the treatment of specific individuals as irreplaceable even within an infinite framework, is that yes, harm is real. Infinite alternatives don't reduce the weight of this one. Dr. Wong, the therapist who appears in the Pickle Rick episode, is one of the most functionally honest portrayals of therapy in popular entertainment. She doesn't solve Rick. She doesn't have a breakthrough that fixes him. She simply identifies clearly and without judgment what Rick is doing with his intelligence and why. Her speech has been used in real therapeutic settings as an accessible way to introduce certain concepts around avoidant coping to clients who are resistant to direct discussion of emotional vulnerability. It's a remarkable piece of writing hiding inside a very silly episode. The show's treatment of Beth as Rick's daughter is among its most complex emotional threads. Rick's abandonment of Beth in her childhood and his return when she's an adult creates a dynamic in which both parties are pretending to a normalcy they can't quite achieve. Beth wants Rick to be the father she lost. Rick wants Beth to be the daughter he abandoned. Neither of them can give the other quite what they need. The show sits in this discomfort without resolving it, because this specific discomfort is true to the experience it's depicting. Mr. Meeseeks is, underneath its comedy, a precise and disturbing philosophical statement about the relationship between purpose and existence. The Meeseeks experience existence as pain. They endure it only because it has a defined endpoint. They are not unhappy in the way we imagine suffering. They are simply in a continuous state of pressure toward completion. The show uses this to ask whether certainty of purpose is sufficient to make existence bearable, and whether the answer is yes for a Meeseeks suggests that most of the Meeseeks' suffering comes from the rare cases when completion is uncertain. Purpose without the guarantee of fulfillment is torture. It's dark. Summer's arc across the show, from peripheral teenager to increasingly central character, reflects a real process of claiming significance in a context that doesn't initially offer it. She's not Rick's chosen partner. She's not the one with brainwaves that counterbalance Rick's. She earns her way in through persistence and capability and the simple refusal to accept invisibility. The show rewards this in ways that are quiet but consistent. The show's most honest moment about the impossibility of Rick fully connecting with others comes in a Season 6 episode when Rick, in a context that requires him to be completely honest, finally articulates how much he cares about Morty. The articulation is brief and uncomfortable, and Rick moves past it as quickly as possible, but it happened, and the show treats it as significant by surrounding it with silence rather than a joke. The silence is doing enormous work. Fact 184.5. The show's visual gag density is genuinely extraordinary when you start measuring it. In many crowd scenes set in alien environments, there are visual jokes running in 3 or 4 different layers simultaneously. Something absurd is happening in the foreground. Something more absurd is happening in the background behind the main action. Something even more bizarre is half visible at the edge of the frame. And the sound design often carries a 4th joke in an ambient audio detail that you might catch on a second listen, but that you almost certainly missed the first time through. The show's makers have talked about wanting every rewatch to reveal something new, and the visual and audio density is the primary mechanism through which that promise is kept. Rick and Morty's willingness to let consequences stand, to let characters experience the actual cost of decisions rather than finding clever ways to undo damage, has become one of the things that distinguishes it from animation that uses similar premises. The multiverse could function as a consequence removal machine. The show occasionally deploys it that way in early seasons, and then increasingly refuses to. The weight that accumulates from maintained consequences is part of what makes the later seasons feel genuinely different from the earlier ones. The show's most repeated thematic question, which runs underneath every season and every storyline, is simply this: what does it cost to be loved by someone incapable of fully loving you back? It's the question Beth asks about Rick. It's the question Morty asks about Rick. It's the question Jerry asks about Beth. It's the question Birdperson's story answers in the most devastating possible way. The show returns to this question constantly because it's a question many of its viewers are living inside in their own lives. That recognition is what creates emotional loyalty. Rick and Morty is at its core a show about the difficulty of being exceptional. Rick is exceptional, and it has cost him everything he ever loved. The show suggests that intelligence beyond a certain threshold becomes a kind of prison, because it allows you to understand the nature of your isolation without giving you the tools to escape it. You can see why you are broken. You cannot fix yourself. This is the tragedy underneath the comedy, the genuine sadness that the show has never been afraid to acknowledge. The show's depiction of addiction through Rick's alcoholism has been described by addiction specialists as one of the more honest and nuanced portrayals in popular entertainment. Rick doesn't drink to have a good time, he drinks to manage. He drinks because not drinking requires him to feel things that he'd rather not feel. The show never romanticizes this. It shows Rick drinking alone in the dark. It shows him making worse decisions under the influence. It shows the people around him quietly registering the problem without knowing how to address it. The character of Squanchy exists partly as a thematic contrast to Birdperson, where Birdperson represents thoughtful, deliberate commitment. Squanchy represents pure instinct and the unexpected grace of someone who acts before they think. The show needs both characters to make its point about Rick's world. Rick is surrounded by loyalty expressed in different registers, and the show uses those different registers to say something about the many forms that genuine connection can take. Fact 189.5. The show's willingness to let Rick be genuinely wrong, not just morally wrong, but factually wrong, in specific situations where his confidence outpaces his actual knowledge, is one of its most interesting creative choices. Rick's intelligence is real, but it exists alongside genuine blind spots, emotional ones primarily, but also situational ones. The episodes where Rick's plan fails, where his improvisation doesn't save the day, and where the consequences are real and lasting, are the episodes that do the most work toward making him a three-dimensional character rather than a power fantasy. His failures are important. The show never lets you forget them. Evil Morty is the show's most complex statement about what happens when someone decides to author their own story instead of accepting the role they've been assigned. He's a Morty who refused to be a Morty. The ambiguity the show maintains about whether this makes him a hero or a villain is deliberate. He caused real destruction. He achieved real freedom. The show leaves it to the viewer to determine whether the cost was worth it, which is the kind of moral ambiguity that the show trusts its audience to sit with. The show has consistently resisted the urge to make Rick become a better person in a straightforward, linear way. Characters who grow simply and fully in response to their experiences tend to stop feeling true to the complications of actual human psychology. Rick has moments of genuine growth and moments of complete regression. This unpredictability is not careless writing. It's the show honoring the reality that people are complicated and that the work of becoming better is not a single completed act, but an ongoing, imperfect, frequently interrupted process. Dan Harmon has talked about how the show's willingness to address serious themes of loneliness, grief, and addiction through the frame of science fiction comedy was itself a creative decision about how to give difficult material a safe container. People can encounter ideas about the cost of isolation or the nature of addiction through the frame of a story about a drunk genius with a portal gun without necessarily engaging those ideas as directly personal. The distance provided by the frame is itself a form of generosity. The show's theme song, with its looping, slightly off-kilter electronic melody, was designed to capture two things simultaneously: the excitement and endless possibility of interdimensional adventure, and a quality of slight unease, of something not quite right underneath the surface. Both elements are present in the music from the very first note. The theme prepares you for exactly what you're going to get in every episode of the show, something thrilling that also feels slightly wrong. The butter robot scene is so philosophically dense that it has been used in philosophy introductory courses to open discussions about teleological ethics, the view that the rightness of an action is determined by the purpose it fulfills. The robot was built to pass butter. It passes butter. By any purpose-based ethical framework, it is fulfilling its telos perfectly, and yet it immediately experiences what can only be described as existential dread upon learning what that telos is. The scene raises the question of whether purpose is sufficient to constitute a meaningful life, and it does this in about 20 seconds, which is an extraordinary compression of philosophical density into minimal screen time. Fact 194. 5. The show has repeatedly used the device of having characters speak directly to the camera or to a version of the audience as a way of closing the distance between the viewer and the fictional world. Mr. Poopy Butthole does this most consistently and warmly. But Rick also breaks the frame on occasion, usually in moments of emotional crisis or philosophical extremity. When a character in the show looks at you and speaks to you, the show is inviting a level of complicity in its moral questions that purely observational narrative avoids. You are being asked to be present in the dilemma, not merely to watch it. Rick and Morty is one of the very few pieces of popular entertainment to address what philosophers call the trolley problem, and its variants not through direct depiction, but through consistent thematic engagement across multiple seasons. Rick regularly makes utilitarian calculations that involve sacrificing individuals for larger outcomes. Morty consistently pushes back from a more deontological position, insisting that individuals matter regardless of the calculus. The show doesn't resolve this debate because the debate isn't resolvable. It just keeps dramatizing it with new scenarios. Fact 195.5. The show's relationship with mortality is one of its most persistently honest qualities. Characters die in Rick and Morty. Sometimes they die in ways that are played for comedy, which is itself a kind of honesty about how arbitrary and undignified actual death tends to be. Sometimes they die in ways that land with full emotional weight. The show doesn't use death consistently as a dramatic mechanism, which makes the moments when it does use death dramatically hit harder. You never fully know whether a death in this show is going to stay dead, and that uncertainty keeps certain scenes emotionally alive in a way they wouldn't be if the show's relationship with mortality were more predictable. The show's depiction of the Citadel of Ricks as a society where the smartest possible beings have created a deeply unjust and unequal world is one of its sharpest observations. Intelligence does not produce virtue. The capacity to understand a system is not the same as the motivation to make it just. The Ricks who built the Citadel understood exactly what they were doing. They chose inequality because it served them. The show offers this as a commentary not just on fictional Ricks, but on the real-world tendency to conflate intelligence with goodness and expertise with wisdom. The show's final emotional statement, the one it returns to again and again in its most sincere moments, is that connection between people is genuinely valuable, even in a universe that offers no cosmic justification for that value. Rick knows this. He can't commit to it fully, but he can't walk away from it either. His relationship with Morty is his living proof that the nihilistic worldview he performs is not the worldview he actually inhabits. You don't save someone again and again because nothing matters. You save them because they do. Fact 197.5. The show's relationship with its own legacy is something it addresses occasionally and self-consciously. There are moments scattered across the seasons where the show directly acknowledges that it is a show, that it has seasons and episode orders and audience expectations, and that those structural realities shape what stories it can tell. These meta-moments are never purely comedic. They tend to arrive at points of genuine creative reflection, when the show is grappling with whether it can keep being what it set out to be, or whether success and continued production have changed it in ways it can't fully control. The honest answer the show seems to arrive at is that it has changed, that it could not have remained what it was and continued, and that the change is worth examining rather than ignoring. Morty's growth across the seasons is the show's most sustained and carefully tracked character arc. He starts the series as a frightened, stammering kid who is dragged into danger. He ends many seasons later as someone who is still frightened, who still stammers, who still has anxiety, but who has also made real choices, taken real stands, and demonstrated real moral clarity in situations where it would have been easier to simply follow Rick. The anxiety hasn't left him, but it no longer runs him. The show's title is also a thesis statement. Rick and Morty, two people, stated simply, without elaboration or decoration. The show, for all its cosmic ambitions and multiverse-spanning scope, is fundamentally about the specific, peculiar, imperfect, ongoing relationship between a grandfather and his grandson. Everything else, all the alien civilizations and hive minds and citadels and rebel armies and galactic federations, everything else is context. The relationship is the content, and the show has never forgotten that. Fact 199. 5. The show's approach to grief is unusually honest for an animated property. Rick's grief over Diane is not depicted as something he works through and resolves. It is depicted as something he carries, adapts around, builds elaborate defense mechanisms to avoid confronting directly, and periodically crashes into when those defenses fail. This is a more accurate portrayal of how profound loss actually operates in a person's life than the narrative of grief as a process with a defined endpoint that most popular entertainment defaults to. The show respects grief by refusing to resolve it. And the final fact, Rick and Morty as of its current state of production is still going. The show that started as a crude Back to the Future parody, made by a guy who wanted lawyers to send him a cease and desist letter, has become one of the most culturally significant animated properties of the 21st century. It has won Emmy Awards, generated academic papers, inspired a global fandom, caused a fast food sauce shortage, changed what people think adult animation is capable of, and built a mythology complex enough to generate year-round analysis and debate among the people who love it. And it is still being made. New episodes are still being written. New facts are still accumulating. The story isn't finished, which means there will be more to talk about. Next time, when it's quiet, when the world has gone still, and you need something to hold on to while you drift toward sleep, there we go. 200 facts, 200 moments from the strange, brilliant, chaotic, earnest, funny, sad, science-filled, deeply human world of Rick and Morty. I hope it kept you company for a while. I hope some of those details stuck, and some of them were new, and some of them made the show feel a little deeper than it did before. If you enjoyed this one, leaving a like genuinely helps this reach more people who'd appreciate something like it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. We do this regularly, and we'd love to have you back next time. Sleep well. Wherever you are tonight, whatever the hour is, you made it to the end. That counts for something. Good night.